And today we're going to be in Revelation 1, verses 9 through 20, and this is looking at the vision of the Son of Man, or really it's a vision of Jesus, and that's what we're going to look at as we read through this today. So, a lot of notes on this one. Honestly, a lot of these, the readings aren't going to be really long on them. The notes are. I'm trying to go as deep as and extensive as I can in a 10 to 15 minute video. So we'll look at that, and then we'll look at the note, read this and look at the notes, and try to go as deep as we possibly can in a 15-minute video. So he says, I, John, starting verse 9, I, John, am your brother and your partner in suffering and in God's kingdom and in the patient endurance to which Jesus calls us. I was exiled to the island of Patmos for preaching the word of God and for my testimony about Jesus. It was the Lord's day, and I was worshiping in the Spirit. Suddenly I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet blast. It said, write in a book everything you see and send it to the seven churches in the cities of Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergam, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. When I turned to see who was speaking to me, I saw seven gold lampstands, and standing in the middle of the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man. He was wearing a long robe with a gold sash across his chest. His head and his hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like flames of fire. His feet were like polished bronze refined in a furnace, and his voice thundered like empty ocean waves. I'm sorry, like mighty ocean waves. He held seven stars in his right hand, and a sharp two-edged sword came out of his mouth, and his face was like the sun in all of its brilliance. When I saw him, I fell down at his feet as if I were dead. But he laid his right hand on me and said, don't be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I died, but look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and the grave. Write down what you have seen, both the things that are now happening and the things that will happen. This is the meaning of the mystery of the seven stars you saw in my right hand and the seven golden lampstands. The seven stars are the angels of the seven churches, and the seven lampstands are the seven churches. And so we see here, this vision. John is praying, worshiping, and he has this vision. And so we'll dive into this just a little bit and kind of hit the notes. And so this third introduction is historical. It shows communicating with humanity in historical events, and that looking through this. And so God gave John a significant mission while he was in exile, while he was on the island of Patmos. And he refers to himself as your brother and your partner. And so, though separated from other Christians, right, by his imprisonment, um, John still shared a sense of community with the suffering and based on the hopes of God's kingdom with other people that he was a willingness and that there was a willingness to endure. And so he was on the Roman fortress on the island of Patmos, and this housed prisoners and exiles. And in Patmos, it was in a group of islands that protected one of the ports, one of the Roman ports that we see here. And he was there for preaching and for my testimony. And what's kind of interesting is they would have been the same thing. And this was used a lot. Parallelism was used a lot in these type of writings. And so by John's time, what we have here, and again, one of the things that I commented on and think is I feel like in my research and looking that it looks like he wrote this probably in about 90 A.D. Now, some do think it. Some authors, some think it could have been around 60 A.D. Again, I'm not going to argue the details. It's hard for us to know for sure, but it looks like it was around this time, and so by this time, the Jews were convincing the Roman authorities that Christianity was different from Judaism and therefore not an authorized religion. And so, since it was not an authorized religion, there was persecution that was happening, and they were being arrested. And so he says that he was worshiping on the Lord's day, and this designation. I'm sorry. Was used in the Roman world to refer to the celebrations in honor of Caesar, right? The Lord's Day. But Christians, they use that term to refer to their weekly worship celebrating Jesus' resurrection. And so the earliest Christians, early on, they would have worshipped in the Jewish synagogues on the Sabbath, and that would have been the last day of the week. This would have been a Saturday. But by the time Revelation came around, or was written, or John wrote Revelation, they had been excluded from the synagogues, and their gathering on that day, they would gather on that on the what they call the Lord's Day, to remember the resurrection, and that would have been typically on the first day of the week. And so that's why typically you see that most churches meet on Sundays. Again, we talked about this when we went through Paul's letters. It doesn't matter. If you meet on a Saturday and on a Sunday, it doesn't matter if you meet on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, right? But the designation here for the Lord's Day would have been typically a Saturday or a Sunday, depending on the time frame and who they were, and so we look at that. So he turns around, he looks, he sees this. God instructs him to write in sin, and so God authorized Jesus here. We're going to see that this is Jesus. Authorized John as a prophet and as a herald of this revelation. And so John's first vision here is a symbolic picture of Christ, who Christ is, as a wise, secure, and powerful agent of God, who always cares for his people. And we're going to see that. And so when he turns around, he sees 7 golden lampstands. And so the lighted menorah, more than likely, is what this was a symbol of God's presence among his people. And so to turn around and see the 7 golden lampstands was to acknowledge in this symbolism, in the way this is written, that this was the Son of Man, right? This was the Son of God. And so he had, and that the presence of God and the all-seeing eyes in the world, right? You have the all-seeing eyes of the world, and so he says, like the Son of Man. He looked like the Son of Man, and this was a title that Jesus used for himself. You can see that in Matthew. There's several times in Matthew that would go through that. And so the idea is as John turns around, sees the 7 golden lampstands, which is a symbolic of God, and then he sees someone who looks like the Son of Man, which is Jesus, right? So it's basically, in a way, he's using symbolism to say, hey, I turned around and Jesus was standing there. And he was wearing a long robe and a gold sash. And so these things give Christ that authoritative appearance, right, that we see there. In the robe, a priestly garment, symbolized purity and holiness. And so it goes back to that high priest image, which we know Christ is, and also the symbolism of the robe, being the long robe and the golden sash, and those things there. And he had white hair, which represent wisdom and maturity, right? This vision reflects what Daniel's vision was of the ancient one. If you go back and look at Daniel 7:9, and like one of the things I talked about when we started this, a lot of this imagery that we're going to see is pulled from the Old Testament, and so I try to put as much of the Old Testament verses that this linked with inside some of these notes and stuff, so that way you have an idea of what that looks like. It's there. So he had the white hair, which represents wisdom, maturity, and then his eyes were like flames of fire. And so the reason he uses this symbolism was, that the fire like would pierce through pretense, right? One who knows everything and will judge everyone is what, God basically, the flames of fire and that vision is basically he knows everything, he sees everything, and it can pierce through, through everything and see what's there. And so then he mentions about his feet being refined, or hardened bronze, and in the feet, right, this implies stability, firmness, and security. And so again, just that symbolism of who Christ is, and how that in him there's stability, right? There's firmness, there's security in Christ. And then he speaks, and then when he speaks, there's this thundering voice, which again suggests God's power. And that idea is that when God speaks, people are going to listen. He's going to be heard. You're not going to ignore his voice. And so you look at the thundering voice, and then he shifts from, okay, the description of who Jesus is, to the 7 stars. And so the 7 stars represent the complete church. And that's the thing we have to understand. The number 7 in Revelation, and even in most of the Bible that we see, is a representation of either perfection, completeness, wholeness, that kind of symbolism. So anytime you see this the word seven in here, like seven stars, seven lamps, seven, any of these things, it represents, a completeness, perfection, that kind of idea there. And so he has the seven stars. They're in his right hand. So it's the complete church, and it's a representation of the whole church that is secure in the right hand of God. So if something was in the right hand, then it was held firmly. And so the symbolism here is he's seeing Jesus here holding and who has hold of the in complete control of the seven churches of I'm sorry, of the whole church as a whole. And so then he speaks, and as he's speaking, he uses the symbolism of a sharp sword, two-edged sword coming from his mouth. And this is the idea that, hey, his message is effective. It's going to be heard. It's sharp. That symbolism is used in Genesis, Ephesians, Hebrews, those type of things of, God's word being sharper than a two-edged sword. And so John describes all this of seeing Jesus, being in the presence of God. And he says, when I saw him, I fell dead. Now, he didn't literally die. Again, he's using, imagery language that kind of exaggerates here. But basically, he saw this and fainted like anyone else would do, right? And what usually happens when people saw God, this is one of the things that happened here. And so we see this, and of course he fainted, just like about anyone would. And I think we see anyone every time they saw the presence of God, they fainted. And so the Lord, what we see here, Jesus responds graciously, right? He touches him again with his right hand, and he says the words, "Don't be afraid." And so we see that again. He has concern for John, and that's who God Christ is. That who he is. And then he says and tells him who he is. He says, "I am," and we're going to see the phrase "I am." We've seen it before. Jesus used it when he was on this earth, and God used it when we asked, what's your name? Who do I tell him you are? And the idea is just I am. And so anytime you see the phrase I am in here, it is Jesus referring to himself as God, or God referring to himself as God. And he says, I am the living one. And again, this is symbolic language of who he is. He's alive. He died and he was resurrected. And so, because the Son of Man had conquered death, he holds the keys of death and controls. And so, the outcome there is hey, he's in control of probably one of our greatest fears that we see here. And so then he instructs him and says, "Write." And so in this vision, God instructs John to write what he sees. Now we're going to see there's a couple of times where he tells him not to. Right? This is, John gets to see some things that we don't know what John said, because God told him not to write those things. And so we'll talk about that when he gets there. And says, he tells him to write what you have seen. And he says, these are both things that are now happening and things that will happen. And so the vision of the purpose of this vision is to help the church understand the present things that are going on. So it was written, for the church then, but it's also written for us, for what things that are going to happen in the future. And so that's where, when we're going through this, I talked about this in the introduction video. I think it was the introduction video, where some of these things are going to be things that have already happened, right? That probably refer more to the Roman Empire, but there's things in here that are symbolisms of things that have not happened yet, and so things that are going to happen, and that's where we've got to try to figure that out and what those things mean. And so we're going to try to do that as we go through this and look at this, and so but the whole idea of Revelation is to help the church and help the church basically get through persecution, get through hard times, get through things, and have that realization that in the end, God's in control, God's going to win, his people are going to win. And so John's to record these things as instructions for the churches, and that we'll see that. And then he finishes with talking about the angels or messengers of the seven churches. And it could be, there's kind of some different things on how this with this ending here. of what the different scholars think each one means. Number one, it could be the guardian angels of the churches. It could be the leading officials of the churches. Not as many mean that, because you're it's using the word that for angels here, and so that or it could be a personification of the churches, right? So the best understanding is probably a combination of 1 and 3, like the angels, or the angels that represent the the churches as a whole. Probably is kind of the same, the idea of the meaning and symbolism here. So as always, I hope that you are learning from this. I know I have to go through this fast, and so I hope that it's not too fast. I don't want these to be too much longer than 15 minutes. And so I'm trying to do that and get through all that as much as I can, because again, I try to hit each almost every other word is a symbolism, or section is a symbolism. And so it can be a little bit harder. But what we're going to do tomorrow, so basically what we've seen here is John has seen Jesus. Jesus has shown up to John and says, "Hey, this is who this is who I am. I want you to write some letters to the churches of some things that are happening and now and are going to happen in the future, and I want you to write them down." And so the church has this message going forward. So to summarize, that's kind of what he says there. And so tomorrow we're going to start with the message to the church in Ephesus. We'll see that, we'll go through that, and those are a little less symbolic, a little more straightforward. After we get through the message to the 7 churches, then we really start to get into a lot of symbolism and apocalyptic type language that we go through there. So as always, I hope that you're learning from these. I hope this study is interesting for you. I encourage you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so yet. That way you can continue to follow along with us. And as always, I appreciate everyone who takes time to watch these, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.